so we've been doing this sermon series on what it means to talk about the soul or the Spirit of God. Those are hard things for us because it's not physical. We're really big into physical stuff, right? We like to see things, touch things, have things proven to us. And we're not the only ones. If you read your scriptures, there's about 9,485 people that are talked about in there that went through the same issues that we're going through. So the good thing is that we're not alone in any of this. And so we have been talking a lot about the soul. And I think this statement up here is very true, that we do not have a soul. We are a soul. We have a body. And I think if we paid attention to the order of that just might change the way that we view ourselves, right? It might change the way that we view our purpose in this life. It might even change the way that we view what church is about and taking church back to its original purpose. And so, yes, we have been talking about taking care of our souls. Here's another thing that angers me. I gotta wear glasses. Because like it or not, there's people here. Like it or not, our souls are really a key player in this whole relationship of ours with God. In the way that my simple mind has to visualize things, I like to think of our souls as something that God has created in us. We're created by God, and our souls have just been embedded somewhere at birth. And when we acknowledge that, hey, I'm just not some random person floating around on this earth having a hard day because I'm sweating all the small stuff, but actually acknowledge that I am a child of God and I put forth a lot of this effort to care for this soul of mine. But we soon discover some amazing things. That the more involved we get in understanding who we are and putting forth care to our soul, the more we understand that this is how God speaks to us. That's interesting. But it's also how God strengthens us, how God feeds us, comforts us, empowers us to do things that we would never consider doing with our lives, in places we never even thought about going. Also a way God sends us to go to places and do things never would cross our mind. Here's something I want to get across for you today. You cannot be more closer to God than you are right now in this moment. And I'm not talking about coming into this place. God doesn't live here. We gather here. We cannot be any closer to God right now because it is God who is within us. That you are a very significant person in the eyes of God, and God is a very significant part of you. There's nothing we can do where we can run from God. There's not a place we can go on this planet we can hide from God. We cannot escape from God. Now, we might feel distant from God, right? We might feel that God has abandoned us. We might even feel that God has no care for us whatsoever. But that is our misconception. And the solution to solving the problem is that we need to tend to this place where God resides, our very soul. See, folks, this is why we need church. And more importantly, church, this is why we need to do church correctly, if that makes sense. Let's think about our lives. The value of school and the value we place on education. Why? Because it works on our brains, right? It creates wisdom within us. And we respect the teachers because teachers have been called by God to teach and to learn and to grow people's minds. Think about hospitals. It's a place that tends to our bodies. And we gain a lot of respect and recognition to doctors, and we care for them. We listen to everything they have to say. We're supposed to anyway, right? And do the very things that they tell us to do in order for our bodies to be successful. But the church is the only place on this planet that tends to our very souls. And yes, we do need to respect those who God calls to lead us in those directions to help us. Because the problem that I see in this world in which we live is this, that we tend to think that we're just kind of human beings running around trying to have this religious experience and trying to figure out who this God is somewhere in the distant clouds. And so we place a whole lot more value on education. We place a whole lot more value on our medicine, on politics of all things, more value in the working place than we put in church. But what if, people? What if the opposite were true? What if the scriptures taught us, and we believe what they say, that God created us as souls that belong to God? And we have been placed on this earth to have a human experience, and we struggle, folks. We struggle to find ourselves to determine that who is going to own us in this life, right? Think about that. Who is going to own you? Who claims you? Who's going to get the best of you? And who are you going to give your best to? Who's it going to be? Think about your life right now. Is it your boss? Is it your work? Is it your business? Is it your addictions? Are they getting the best of you? What about your kids, your spouse? Do they own you? Or parents when they get older? Man, they feel like they own me. Is it our selfishness, this desire to always want, need, get? Or are we allowing God to own us? Claim you to get the best out of you. The very day we were born, our struggle begins. And the very day we make that decision to be baptized into Christ is the day that we confess out of our realization that there is something else in our lives that needs attention than what this world has to offer. Through our baptism, we declare that we will care for, that we will tend to our very souls. And we will allow God to direct our lives. How is your baptism working out for you? Ask that question right now. Who is winning the battle over you? Struggle's real. We're going to look at Jesus' baptism. Because Jesus' baptism marked the beginning of a new life for him. It was the beginning of his ministry. Have you ever noticed that when you read the Gospels? That there's this much about Jesus from his baptism to his death and resurrection? What happened before that? I don't know. Well, we don't know. That's the point. 3 years is made up of this much. 30 years, this much. There's a reason for that. There's 2 Gospels that don't even mention the birth of Jesus. Anything, they begin with the baptism of Jesus. The other 2 Gospels give us material that leads us, that sets up the baptism of Jesus. Because from the moment that he was baptized, he would redefine his life. The moment in his life would be defined how he began to reflect God's love everywhere he went, period. Even if it meant being killed for it. His baptism really is a beautiful, beautiful story that's filled with so much imagery, where he allowed God to descend upon his life and his soul. And he allowed God's purpose to be lived out with everything that he said and everything that he did. I want you to listen to the story of his baptism. So at the risk of the snores echoing, I want you to close your eyes. And I want you to see the image that's taking place. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven. You are my Son. You are my beloved. With you, I am well pleased. Feel stuck? Where would be without these guys? The choir's been amazing. Yeah. Thank you, thank you. A lot of things to talk about this morning. But the good news is, the Cowboys don't kick off till 3:25. Probably 3:30 since all the commercials, right? So we got that extra 5 hanging over our heads. So, baptism to us is a very important topic because it's really more than what we've made it out to be. I think when I hear a lot of conversations about baptism, and in fact, I've had a couple of folks who've met with me, and it's like, I want to get baptized because I figure it won't hurt. Well, they obviously haven't been baptized by me, right? We'll make it hurt. It's just like one of those things sometimes that gets used to say, I'm really afraid I'm going to go to hell, so if I just get baptized, that'll kind of cover that little deal, right? It's kind of like buying an insurance. That's our insurance program. The cost for our insurance is to get a little wet behind the ears. And so it's a lot more to it to that, especially in our day and time of what we are experiencing. And when we really look at the baptism of Jesus, we're seeing a very significant event that took place because right after that baptism, his life would never be the same again. Now, if Jesus died at age 29 before he's baptized, you think he'd go to heaven or hell? Now, you're thinking about that, I know, right? You're going, boy, I never gave much thought. Really has nothing to do with that because I think a lot of us already live in hell. We create a lot of that ourselves, or are we just born in that type of environment? But what's really being offered to us through this baptism is a whole new outlook of life. But more than that, about what you're capable of doing through this person that we talk about every Sunday, which is this Jesus of Nazareth and what he can do for us. After that moment of his baptism, I love that imagery of of God coming down upon him. And then hearing those words, I think every last one of us would love to hear the vocal words of God saying, man, jeez, Jack, I'm so pleased with you. You're my beloved child. Who wouldn't want to hear that from God? If you don't want to hear that, then there's something seriously wrong with you. Because just the thought of that can bring tears to my eyes if I let it. But it was at that moment that he was gearing up to do the greatest adventure that this world has ever seen. That he was about to be used in a manner which God designed him to be used. He spent 30 years waiting for this moment, preparing himself, nurturing his soul, and now he was about to be used in the manner which God designed him to be used. And the word that we use for that is the word we call ministry. It's just not something you pay people to get up on stage and do. That's what we all do. Every last one of us. And so I want to look at the baptism, but I don't want to look at Jesus' baptism. I want to look at another baptism. There's a great story that I love, absolutely love, in the book of Acts. You know the book of Acts? The book of Acts is a continuation of the Gospel of Luke, okay? The book of Luke was a guy who wrote the are we starting? You're done. I'm done? Finally, applause. Sorry, I gotta make a bet for the game today. I didn't mean to break in. James, where was I? The book of Acts, thank you. It's a continuation of the Gospel of Luke. You know, Luke was a guy who was writing the story about Jesus to these people who really didn't have an experience with God, and he took into it and he really found himself like, wow, this is great. And then Jesus dies, right? And then what happens to all of these people who all of a sudden find themselves with no one to follow? You have all these people and these disciples who just spent 3 years of their life just following this Jesus around, believing everything that he had to say, risking their lives, being with him, putting up with him, abandoning their families, abandoning their jobs, and just moving in the direction that he chose to do it. And all of a sudden they get to this place in Jerusalem and he's gone. The book of Acts is the book of panic. Because all of a sudden they're left with their hands in pockets going, what do we do now? What are we supposed to do with our life? We can't go back to where we were, to what we did. What now? And so the book of Acts is a continuation that says, this is what we do. This is who we are. And the book of Acts is really a story of how Jesus continued his ministry through a group of baptized followers called the church. This is a very important statement because the book of Acts is a story of how who? Continued his ministry, but Jesus isn't there anymore. But it's how he chose to continue his ministry through people who have made a commitment to him, who have been baptized. And they're now called what? The church. Let's put it in a little simplistic form. I'm a very simplistic person. Church is not controlled. Here's a hard part. Is that in there? No, good. The church is not controlled by the congregation. No. The church is not controlled by a group of elders. The church is not controlled by the boards. And we all know the church isn't controlled by the preacher. Or anybody else we hire to be staff. The church is controlled by who? Man, that sounds like religious talk, doesn't it? But it's so true. It's so very true. The church is under the control of Jesus. How Jesus continues his ministry is through who? Yes, yes. It's not for you to go hire somebody to do it for you, right? Because our mission is to do the very things that God needs to accomplish in this world. Understand that. That the church is the way that God continues to do the mission in the world. It is what God needs us to do. Right? So those who are gifted with special gifts, those who put in the effort to tend and to care for their souls and place themselves in the position to listen to the voice of God, have been called to that very sensitive position to lead the church in the direction that God needs to go. Y'all follow me on that? Do I need to say it again? You want to get out of here, don't you? So let's look at the book of Acts. There's this guy named the Apostle Paul, main player in the book of Acts. And Paul was the kind of guy that put himself in position to listen to God. He chose to listen to God who spoke to his soul. And this God interrupted one of Paul's 4 missions to go to a place where the Spirit was trying to direct him. It's a crazy story. It wouldn't happen today very often. So the mission took place in the 16th chapter of the book of Acts, if you want to go back and read that. Paul was on a trip. He was making a journey. He's going to make his way west. He's going to go into this place called Asia and take the gospel to a place that never been there before. That's kind of cool. And so he goes through all this time, this effort, and this planning to make this way, to go all the way to Asia, to start ministering to people and talking to people who don't have a clue who this Jesus person is. And so what happens then, through his great planning, is that all of a sudden, God changes things up on him. God interrupts his plans. Has anybody had their plans interrupted before? Does anybody have a father like mine who says, we are going on vacation? And those little dots that we have on the map, that is where you're allowed to have a bathroom break for 13 seconds. Because by this time, we're going to have to reach this point. And then we're going to go to this point. And you're going to look, and you're going to have fun for 3 minutes. And we're going to get back in the car, and we're going to go here. That was a plan. We never went off the plan. So we chose never to go on vacations again. Paul had a plan. He had everything mapped out. And this wasn't, oh, we got a week to get there. He's like, hey, I think we got a few years. We could get where we need to go. And so on the way to Asia, all of a sudden, he has this vision. This man comes to him in this vision and says, hey, you need to go north. Go to Europe. So what happened? I think Paul's response is pretty amazing, and it certainly would not be my response, okay? This is what happened. When Paul had seen this vision, he what? He did what? He what? We what? Immediately, right? It's like, well, you know, we like to go see Asia first. We heard there's some neat stuff over there. Maybe we'll circle back around when it's our time. You see, Luke is writing this story because Luke is with Paul at this point. And so he's trying to figure out what all is going on. And so when he says that Paul all of a sudden sees this vision, and immediately we tried to cross to Macedonia because trying to get to Macedonia is not easy. When God calls us to do something, it doesn't make, oh man, we got the easy button. Everything's going to be so simple. We're just going to go, we're going to conquer and do our thing and then go back and get in time for ice cream. It doesn't work that way. He tried to cross over into Europe. Why? Because he was convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. Convince is a strong word. Immediately is a strong word. People of faith should be having the same type of tendencies, that we take care of our souls and our lives so well that we know that it's God speaking to us. And so when God feels urge to do something, we immediately get up and we go, because we're convinced that God needs us to help the people who are in need. Because here this story is God identified a need, spoke to Paul, and Paul responded. It's as simple as that. But it's so difficult to do in our life, because this is something we're not used to doing. And let me be honest with you, this is the very reason why ministers go into ministry. This is stuff that really gets us excited. It's for this very reason. You know, we have spent time trying to figure out, is that God's voice calling me to go into ministry? Because I don't want to go there. I know what ministers go through. I know what it's like. Can I just try to make money like everybody else? Can I be free from all that stuff? But we go into ministry because we spend time trying to understand, is that the voice of God that I hear? Is it yesterday's chili? Right? Do I really feel God's voice disrupting my life to move me into a crazy mission to change the world and to move in the direction that God is choosing for me to lead and to live? As ministers, we live for this moment because we are called to change the world. Not sit and watch it change, but to be elements of change, to be instruments of change. And that doesn't happen if you don't pay attention to your soul. Great theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he once wrote to these followers of Jesus, and he writes to the church and says this: you know, people, we must be ready to allow ourselves to be what? Interrupted by God. We're not here to get interrupted. I like the way my life is right now, don't you? I love my bills, right? I love chasing rabbits and trying to figure out how in the world I'm going to get by today or tomorrow. That's a good life. But we have to get ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God. In today's church, folks, I'm sorry, it just doesn't like interruptions. We want things just the way they not are, were. Oh my gosh. Calmer days, weren't they? We can go into that all day long. All day long. We don't want to be interrupted. In fact, we would like to control what God does in the world. Now, this is sarcasm in its finest moment, by the way. Let's think about that for a minute. What if Paul were in the church today? And Paul had this great vision to go into Macedonia while the church was supposed to be doing this. What would that look like? Would it think it made it look a little different? Because Paul would probably have to wait a few weeks to go to the board meeting and talk about this, right? And the board would probably have to create a special committee, right, to work on this Macedonia project that the preacher, the dreamer, pull up this time, and how's it going to fit into our budget, right? And can we afford to let this preacher go off on some trip? We're paying him. He's our employee. How dare we do that? So we have this task force, this committee set up to figure out what this Macedonia project is anyway. Then a couple months later, here comes a report. It's submitted to the board. Well, by this time, gossip's all over the church, and so it's created all sorts of conflict and controversy that now we have to take this special council with the elders to make sure that they know what's going on, and we can smooth this thing out to make sure that they support what's going on in the life of the church. Well, the elders are the elders, and they would like to approve it, and they think, take it back. Hey, this is a good deal. Let's take it back to the board and see what goes on. So another week later passes, and we vote 9-8 to approve what God needs to do in the world. However, it's such an extensive project, right? I think we need congregational approval. But there's so much to be shared because there's so much misinformation being gossiped and shared to the phone lines that you know what we need to do? We need to hold all these middle meetings so your schedules will fit into these meetings so we can have conversation, we can cuss and discuss what in the world God wants to do with us next. And why we have to travel this distance when we got people in our own community who needs help, right? And even if the congregation ends up approving it in the next 3 weeks, then you know what we're going to have to do? We're going to set up a few bake sales so we can raise enough money to fund this trip. My, how the church has changed over the millennials, hasn't it? Let me ask you this question. Do you wonder why an average of 1,700 ministers leave the ministry every year? They want to immediately go change the world. It'll take us 3 years to vote on it. Do you wonder why 10,000 churches a year close their doors for the final time? We must be ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God. Like it or not, God will be heard. God will win. And it would be wonderful if we could say that when Paul had seen this vision for the church, that we immediately try to cross to Macedonia. Because we are what? Convinced. There got to be more than 7 people that believe that in here. Convinced that God has called us to proclaim the good news. Paul and his group changed their plan. And the man in the vision that Paul had to go up to Macedonia, you know who it was? It was a woman. A lady named Lydia, of all things. A professional businesswoman. And what did she do? She opened her house and created a church. What in the world is God thinking making a woman a minister? Don't tell that to a lot of the churches in our community, okay? That's just not going to go over very well. Who does God think God is? God should read our bylaws. But Lydia was just one woman that was impacted by Paul's ability to listen to God and to respond. And you know what? That's not even the best part of the story. We haven't even gotten there yet. How much time you got? You know what I'm saying? There is so much more to this story that's far richer than what we even covered today. And as Michelle used to say, we got what? All the time that we need. 3:25, here we come. We'll cover that next week. Yeah, those 8:30 services are looking better, aren't they? Here's what I want you to hear today, because we're going to finish this story. It's a very powerful story. It is my very, very, very favorite story. I love the story of how the gospel went up to Macedonia, because it wasn't Paul's idea. It was God's. And that's awesome. The power of Paul's story, I think, to me, is very loud and very clear for the church. Because I never, ever, ever, ever want you to think that God does not have a plan for you. Never want you to think that God is not interested in you, that your past is too much, that your present is just too hurtful, that your tendencies tend to be too disruptive, your thoughts are just too out there, or that God just cannot use a person like you. If you think this, then you are not listening to your soul. You are not paying attention to the people in Scripture who felt the exact same way as you. And let me tell you, folks, Macedonia was just one of hundreds of churches created or impacted by the man named Paul, who, by the way, whose former life was the greatest persecutor of people of faith. How about that? Would you call a murderer to be your preacher? I wouldn't either. But God touched him in his life. And Paul opened up his soul. And God opened up Paul's eyes to see the things of God. And that can happen to everyone in this room. I'm going to say this. Your ministry will be different than Paul's ministry. Because Paul already has a ministry. You don't need to Paul's. You're different than Paul. But I'll promise you this, that your ministry will just be as impactful to the person or to the people that God directs you to, as long as you allow yourself to be interrupted by God. There are so many people in worship today, even more people in this community who doubt that God can use us, who are absolutely afraid to give in to God because we don't know what God's going to do with us. So afraid to open up that soul within us. We struggle to even trust the church with something as profound as our souls. I found this statement that was sent to me, and it reminded me of the church. It says this: love didn't hurt you. Someone who does not know how to love hurt you. Don't confuse the two. God is the author of love. And as children of God, we must be committed to love in the same impactful way that God loves. And the only way to experience true love, God's love, is to open up our souls and tend to our souls and offer our souls to God. After we pray, we're going to stand and we're going to sing for this day, for this moment, for the things that are painful in your life. And you will discern what it is that you need to do in order to get into your soul to God and allow God to interrupt your life. Let us pray.